A key problem in developing countries is corruption. There's a lot of evidence that when governments in developing countries get more revenues, for example from the exploitation of natural resources or from foreign aid, they spend it on more corruption, but we actually find little evidence that these extra revenues lead to more spending on things like health and education. The research question I'm interested in is whether governments spend revenues differently if they come from taxes that they levy themselves, as opposed to revenues they get from outside sources, such as foreign aid or the exploitation of natural resources. I look at a tax capacity program that was financed by the Brazilian development banks and that basically offered loans to local governments in Brazil to invest in their tax capacity. So it financed things like improvements in tax registers and audits. I first check whether the program increases tax revenues, and I find that it is successful in raising local tax revenues. And then I look at the impact of these extra tax revenues, thanks to the program, on local outcomes such as education and health infrastructure, as well as corruption. For transfers, I simply look at the impact for large federal government transfers to local governments on these same outcomes: health, education, and corruption. What I find in this research is that when local governments have more tax revenues, we see an increase in both the quantity and quality of local education infrastructure. What I mean by that is that I have data on all the schools in Brazil, primary and secondary schools, and I find that when there's more tax revenues, there's simply more schools in the local governments with more classrooms open in them, but the schools are also of better quality. However, when I look at increase in non-tax transfer revenues, I find no impact whatsoever on the quality and the quantity of local education infrastructure. Results are similar if you're looking at local health infrastructure. There's a small effect, positive effect of more tax revenues on local health infrastructure, no effect of transfer revenues on health. Finally, there's existing research out there that's shown that in this context, when there's more transfer revenues, there's increases in corruption. What I do in my paper is I check what happens to corruption when tax revenues increase, and I find no impact whatsoever. Tax revenues don't seem to be increasing corruption in that context. So what my results suggest that in Brazil, if you're interested in making local governments spend more on health and education, it may be a better idea to help them increase their tax capacity, as opposed to giving them more transfer revenues, which in the end may only increase corruption. If you go at a higher level and you think about national governments in developing countries, my results suggest that foreign development aid that's targeted at increases in tax capacity and that helps these countries have more tax revenues may be the most efficient way to get these governments to spend more on health education and may lead to less corruption.